Okay, so the number one is what was the role of the producer during the recording process?
Well, obviously, when you listen to Sergeant Pepper's, it is the first time really a band went into a recording studio without 100% plan on what they're going to record. And this is to some people, it's a very great thing. To other people, it's a bit of a mess. And I'm afraid to say, I am of the belief that this is one of the messiest albums ever made. It starts off where you think, it starts off with so much potential. The idea, of let me introduce to you the whole thing, your setup. It's a setup of Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. What's going to happen to this band? There are people that you're supposed to get to know in the band. At the beginning, you think this is going to be a coherent story of a concept album that runs through. Now, it doesn't have to be a concept album completely conceptual, but if you take something like The Who's Tommy, that actually has more of what you think. That they all work together, the songs. The songs on Sergeant Pepper do not work together. They have no theme. I mean, personally, if it the recording process actually included Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. These two songs were first recorded for Sergeant Pepper's, but then they decided to release them as a single so that those songs were not on the album. If those songs had been on the album, I would not be making such an impassioned plea for this being one of the worst albums ever made. Strawberry Fields Forever is a fantastic song, and Penny Lane is my personal favourite. Everyone loves those songs. They were recorded during the same sessions, but released as a single. But, when you have... There are no lyrics on this album, really, except for maybe She's Leaving Home is a song that makes you think that, Paul McCartney knows what he's singing about. But songs about holes in the road and good morning and Rita Meter Maid and and to have, I've always thought that the Beatles were some of the best versions of some of the best songs ever made. But the second song on this album is so bad. With a Little Help from My Friends is an okay song, but the way it's produced and made on this album, I mean, you just listen to Joe Cocker's version. Anyone else's version of that song is better than the Beatles' version of that song. So, and then you go to Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, that, let's face it, is just a rubbish drug song. Anyway, ask another question.
So, if we want to look sort of back to the production side of it.
Okay.
And how crucial was to George Martin to the recording process?
Well, George Martin, historically for the Beatles, has been dad, teacher. That teacher who's got the leather patches on his arm, on his elbows. He was the guy who knew about things that the Beatles didn't know about. And this is something, as a producer, I like to feel that my job is that of a safety net, is basically to put the artist in a position where they can be as creative as they want and to be the ultimate sort of, no, that one actually isn't very good, is it? But without the artist feeling they can do that, you never get truly great music. Because if the producer is too much dictatorial, then the artist can't write, in the back of their mind, they're always thinking, oh, will he like it or not? Or, you have to take your ego out and allow the creative process to carry on. And this is what was brilliant with George Martin. And the added bonus, of course, is that his musical arrangements are just spectacular. Even on the first song, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, you've got that great brass band coming in, within about 30 seconds of the song starting. makes you think. Makes you. It promises so much, but ultimately, the album does not deliver, and it actually doesn't sound very good now.
Whose fault do you think that is?
It's the fault lies in the songwriting. I think. I think the production is great, but they were trying. When you go and get your Indian food to George Harrison's Within You, Without You, it's just a pastiche of a style of music that reminds you of flecked wallpaper in the Indian restaurant. And then you go into When I'm 64. I mean, I always like to think continuity is something that is very important in an album. But, it's all subjective, of course, but I can't believe that some of the choices made. And in fact, if you get near the end of the album, when you get to the refrain of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, you actually hear, which apparently was recorded late in the recording process because someone said to them that, why don't you have a reprise of the opening song? And that's a really spirited, great version of a good song. And and that worked out really well. But it's that was letting the band play. Whereas earlier on, it's some of the songs are painful.
Okay. What are your favourite tracks then? You mentioned a couple already. But
Yeah, I think Getting Better is a good. I mean, it's just a breath of fresh air of a good song when it comes in. I like Sgt. Pepper's, the opening track. She's Leaving Home is a great song with lyrics that really resonate, and it's McCartney at his best. Some people say McCartney's songs are too syrupy. I mean, I'm a big fan of Paul McCartney. I think he, I think, but then again, he completely blows it with When I'm 64, which is terrible, and Day in the Life because it's, but without Paul McCartney's effort on Day in the Life at the middle section, which he wrote completely separately, it wouldn't be a great song. But Day in the Life is a great song. As I say, Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever would be my favourite songs on this album.
from a recording, this is going to be somewhat jarring with obviously
Yeah.
he's looking for compliments here rather than the opposite. But the question is, from a recording and production perspective, what is so innovative about Pepper?
What's innovative is, if you go from the end backwards, you go from that long notes that we all know that the band said to the musicians, just start at your lowest points and go up to your highest point. This is what an orchestra had never been asked to do. This was 1967 in London. Abbey Road was very much a studio where the engineers wore white coats with little pens in their top pockets. The word amongst studio people at the time was that don't be on a Beatles session, you'll be there all night. Be on the Harry Seacombe or the Val Doonican session that finishes at 6 o'clock so you can get home. So people who worked at Abbey Road did not want to be on a Beatles session because it was like those weird guys and we're here all night. So it was very much a mentality of 9 to 5 still. And, the good thing about Peppers is that it broke that mold. So in terms of production techniques, as I said, it really does... it really is the first album that decided to make itself in the studio rather than come in with songs already prepared.
Okay. In terms of the dance that would have gone on to create that, do you know how much George Martin was kind of instrumental in adopting that approach?
Yeah, well, George Martin, as I say, was the school teacher. Was the dad, was the guy who would let the band do what they want, but was there as a safety net. And on top of that, he had what made him so brilliant was that his arrangements were so good. So, I don't know whether he said, let's have a brass band on this bit, or whether John said, let's have a brass band on this bit. We will never know that. But it was probably the band, because they had the sort of vision of what they wanted. But you don't hear Ringo Starr. And when you do hear Ringo on the album, every one of his drum fills is the same. It's not, there's no great drumming on this album when there is drumming, except on the refrain of Sgt. Pepper's. You get the feeling that they're really excited when they're playing that. Yeah.
So, like, if we were making a breakdown of what's good or what's bad with, like, various things, you didn't like Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds.
What's wrong with Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds is that the lyrics are just, are just banal, and John at his worst was a meandering fool. At his best, and I think you go later on in the career, Imagine There's No Heaven, It's Easy If You Try, one of the greatest opening lines of any song. It's brilliant. But John at his worst, and let's face it, he was lazy like other people. He used to take his ideas from newspapers that were just sitting around, and make songs. Now, from all the people I've worked with, you must have your antenna up for lyrical inspiration. Bono especially is always listening to what people say, and if he hears a good phrase that someone will say, he'll get his phone out and quickly write it down. You go, what's Bono doing? Oh, right, he's documenting what someone else said that he thinks might be good in a lyric. But it's a lazy man who just looks at the newspaper and takes a line straight from a newspaper. And, Imagine There's No Heaven, It's Easy If You Try. That's not a line out of a newspaper. That's a great lyric. So Lucy in the Sky, lovely Rita Meter Maid, good morning, good morning. Apparently he wrote that because he saw a TV advert for breakfast cereal. I'm sorry, but Fixing a Hole, okay. These are okay songs, but there's, but if you had put Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever on this album, I would not be so scathing. Because some, you even two great songs and two, can tip what is a bad album into a good album. I mean, I when I worked on the Joshua Tree, it was very much like, by the time side 2 started, it was getting pretty thin pickings in terms of hits. There were no hits so much. All the hits were stacked up on side 1.
Are there any other kind of songs you feel like are worth breaking down for what was good or either bad?
No, I mean, John would sometimes fool us by putting all these nice time changes. Some songs, they sound like they're completely normal, but they'll have one bar of 5/4, one bar of 3/4, then go to 4/4. So, Fixing a Hole maybe was like that. It was no, Good Morning was like that. Good Morning has all these different time signatures in it, but at the end of the day, it doesn't cover up the fact that it's a pretty shitty song. I mean, look, I am using the Beatles as my favourite band, so I'm not, I'm being harsh on them. But you have to be harsh on them because, I hold them in such high standard. And when I hear people talk about Sgt. Pepper's as being one of the greatest records ever made, I don't think. I think the definition of that. Well, let me say this. As a person who works in art, I see art everywhere. everything in the world is art. Someone makes decisions to do art, whether it's building or anything you see. It's all man-made, and someone made an artistic decision to put 3 pillars in that place. You know, it's all art. And the great art is timeless art. And of course, the definition of timeless art can only be defined by the passing of time. You know, the Concorde, timeless art. The Chrysler Building in New York, timeless art. I will not say that Sgt. Pepper's is timeless art. It's dated art.
Okay. Well, in that case, and you're probably not going to be very on board with the question of like, did Pepper change pop music or advance?
I was very lucky enough to work with the Rolling Stones in 1986, and they had this wonderful man called Ian Stewart, who was he actually formed the band. I think he was a keyboard player, but the word was that he wasn't really good looking enough to be in the band. But they loved him, and he always worked with them. And he would his job on the album I worked with, he was like their archivist. He would make sure that all the tapes were. You know, he was great, and occasionally he would sit in on a song and play piano with them. You know, and he was loved, and he was part of the family. He came up to me one day and he said, "Steve, you know what ruined music?" I said, "What, Ian?" He says, "The Beatles. Beatles, they ruined music." Now that's a very controversial statement, because I think they enhance music like crazy. But his argument was, before the Beatles, artists would finish their music, finish their songs, and they would go into the studio and record it. Perfectly okay. Even the Beatles were like that at the beginning. Sgt. Pepper's is the moment that artists, and actually you can argue that a lot of bad records have been made by people who decide that music can be made in the studio. Oh, the Beatles did it, so we won't write our songs till we get there. We won't get ready, you know.
So you kind of could you like maybe retake on like that was the moment when, and summarize what you then said into like a more of a soundbite. You were basically saying that like that's the moment when it all just was taken in a overly like.
Yeah. Sgt. Pepper's was a critical moment in music because it was when artists thought it was okay. It was the first time artists decided to write music in a recording studio and to use the recording studio as a fifth instrument. Now, this is what happens all the time now. In fact, the recording studio nowadays is the only instrument. Sgt. Pepper's, you can argue, is the beginning, is the seed that grew the tree that is now music. Oh my God, I'm so fucking flowery today.
Fair enough. Yeah, okay, I hear what you're saying. So that's like that kind of Radiohead sort of style of.
Oh, Radiohead. Yes, Radiohead are a great example of a band who just don't write songs anymore. Except for Spectre. Did you ever hear that song, Spectre?
Which album was that?
Oh, you must hear it. You know the James Bond movie, Spectre?
Yeah.
It was, they were asked to write the music for it. Obviously, when James Bond movie comes out, they ask a few big stars to write a song. They asked Radiohead to write a song. Their song was brilliant. It was never used because it was too weird, but it's one of the greatest ever Radiohead. If you're a fan of Radiohead, you listen to Spectre. I played it to Bono, and he went, "Oh my God, that's brilliant."
Is it available?
Yeah, it was put on SoundCloud for free about 9 months ago, and I think it's now on an album. But you can find it anywhere.
Okay.
Yeah, Spectre by. If you're a Radiohead fan, of great Radiohead, not of like drum loop, stupid Tom York prancing around over a drum loop. Radiohead.
Okay.
But you know, if you love Johnny Greenwood's arrangements, and when they're a band. This is the trouble, is that bands now, when a band was great, it was when the sum was greater than the total of its parts. You know that expression, right? When the total is greater than the sum of its parts. Meaning that, only 4 people, but put them all together, it's like 10 people. And that's what the Beatles at their best were. And as I say, Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields Forever, if they had been on that album, boom.
But they were recorded in the same session?
They were recorded at the beginning of the Peppers sessions. Now, everyone says that Sgt. Pepper's was a long time recording. In fact, it was only 3 months, and it came out only 10 months after the previous album. So, in those days, time was a lot more condensed. The Beatles were only together 5 or 6 years anyway. But yeah, as I say, it was the beginning of using the studio as an extra instrument.
And so, and even though they're not on the album, could you sort of break down what's great about those songs?
Oh, Penny Lane is just paints a picture. It paints a picture of England in the way that some of the great songs paint pictures. I don't see the pictures that are painted by some of the Sgt. Pepper songs. I don't see the pictures, but great. But Penny Lane, She's Leaving Home, great. I mean, Strawberry Fields Forever, a fantastic John Lennon song. Much better than Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. It's just a better song all the way through. It's not plodding. Yeah, just works. Again, this is just my opinion.
So, and you already said that I think you kind of mainly answered the question, but is there anything more to the Sgt. Pepper legacy other than that way of recording in the studio?
Well, the legacy is that it's Sgt. Pepper's, and it was, everything from the artwork to the production style was unique, and it was and it was at the beginning of a it was a flagpole recording moment. There are times in the history of music you can look back and go, okay, Phil Spector was a marker for a sound. Sgt. Pepper's was a marker for a sound. Now, you can argue that it was done a lot better by other people. Right straight off the back of my head, I say Tears for Fears did it so much better than the Beatles did, later in the 80s. But, when you're the first to do anything, you have, there's a certain kudos. But as I say, my definition of timeless art is literally, does it sound good? Timeless. And when I listen to Sgt. Pepper's now, it doesn't hang together as an album. There's some nice production techniques, but you never, and the one good thing about it, none of the songs are too long. That's the one. And it's the whole album is under 40 minutes.
So, for all of its issues and the things that you're citing that you don't like about it, why was it so successful? Why was it so similar?
It was so successful because it was the time. They gauged, and the sleeve and the flower power, and it was the idea of swinging 60s in London and England, and it was a cultural phenomenon as much as a musical phenomenon. The cultural phenomena of the clothes, the and the sleeve was very different to anyone else's album sleeve, and they were the first to do it.
Okay. This is kind of perhaps going over the same ground a little bit again, but how would you assess the musicianship on Pepper, and how unusual was it to have that level of orchestration on a pop record in that time?
Well, there was always orchestration on records before, but what the Beatles were very good at was cross-pollinating, and that was when it was at its best, was when the songs had a mixture of the Beatles of a band, and then all of a sudden you get the brass band coming in, and then obviously where it works so badly is on George Harrison's song, which is just a pastiche of Indian restaurant music. There's nothing in there that is remotely remotely cross-pollinized. It's just a copy, and that's so lazy.
If you've got a least favourite song, which one is it?
Let me look here. Obviously, I don't like Within You Without You. I don't like When I'm 64. I don't like Lovely Rita Maid. I'm not a fan of Good Morning. And that's a hell of a lot. That's a big chunk of side 2 that really, which is why my argument that it's not a timeless classic, I will stand by.
Is there anything particularly out of all of it that you feel is dated, like made it date so badly?
Oh, I think When I'm 64 is so pastiche. Again, when it's a pastiche of a sound that came, like Within You Without You, When I'm 64, it's just embarrassing. When it works, like She's Leaving Home is not a pastiche. It's just a brilliant song, just a lovely song with a great story. You hang on every lyric because you're interested, not because it's weird. It's easy to be weird. Day in the Life is great, and as I say, Penny Lane and Strawberry Fields, which I would love to introduce, to include on this album, but because it's not there, I can't. But that's when they're strong. When they're weak, they're very weak on this record.
Okay. Last one. If you two walked into the studio and said, we want to do a concept album about fictional bands who don't exist and we're going to pretend to be them, what would you have said to them?
If you two had walked in, I would have said, play me the songs.
Maybe repeat the question for this one.
If you two walked in and wanted to do an album of a fictional band, a concept album, I would say, great, let's listen to the songs. Let's try. I mean, the great thing about U2 is that when they have a big idea and it gets executed perfectly, they are brilliant. It's only when the big idea is not executed perfectly. And the thing about the Beatles with Sgt. Pepper, I don't think the big idea was executed properly.
How would you have done it differently?
Oh, how would I have? I would have. I would have dropped When I'm 64 with a little help. Well, Little Help from My Friends is a good song. It's just that, Ringo singing it and having it as the second song on the album is painful. And it's so plodding, so plodding. I mean, when you listen to Joe Cocker singing with a little help from my friends, the meaning of the lyric is so powerful. Whereas when you hear Ringo sing, the meaning of the lyric is nothing. It just goes over your head. So, yeah, that's what I'd do.
Is there one kind of like golden rule for making concept albums that you could share?
The golden rule for making a concept album is probably don't make it. But if you do make it, make sure the concept. And I can argue that the U2's albums are sort of concept albums. The concept of the Joshua Tree, the concept of Eastern Europe with Achtung Baby, the concept of retrospection with All That You Can't Leave Behind. When they get their concepts, I mean, their concepts are a lot more abstract, but there's an overall that's what an album is, and what an album should be is some sort of concept. However you tie it all together, there has to be a concept for the whole thing. That was quite good, that last one. I've never thought like that, but that's good.
All right, cool.
Thank you so much.
I think that's a lot, yeah.
Yeah.
Cheers, Steve.
It'll be chopped up.